I'm so excited to be here in conversation with Zoe and with Miriam, with Maya, Miriam. I'm calling from the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples known as Los Angeles. My name is TJ Shin. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm an interdisciplinary artist. I'm looking at the ontological divides between the human versus the non-human. So for today, I will be sharing with you two projects. The first one called Microbial Speculation of Our Gut Feelings. This was installed at Recess in Brooklyn, New York, the winter of 2020 before COVID. I was responding to a scientific research that was published in the journal Cell that was looking at how immigrants of color coming into the United States go through a process of gut colonization. They lose their native gut microbes, and this loss gets compounded over the generations, meaning the longer you stay in the US, the more likely you're to suffer from metabolic diseases, cancer, inflammation, and mental illnesses. So I was thinking a lot about the direct correlation between gut coloniality and assimilation in this kind of microbial level. This is also the diagram that the Nature Journal also shared. The Previtola strain gets lost, and over time, bacteroid microbiome take over. So in response, I installed a multimedia installation at Recess, a microbrewery, and a greenhouse. And inside, I was actively fermenting lactic acid bacteria, which is bacteria that's found in fermented foods like wine and cheese and kombucha. But when you consume it, it fortifies the indigenous gut microbes that are existing in your body, improving immunity, and so on. And this technique was inspired by Chatham Organic Farming. It's a farming collective based in Korea, and looking at ultra low costs of agriculture started by Young Sung Cho. But one of the things that they make open source is how to produce lactic acid bacteria, mostly for livestock drinking and for plant leaves. But again, lactic acid bacteria is something that also we consume very often anytime we have fermented foods and drinks. So inspired by this technique, I was fermenting lactic acid bacteria as a seed germination and soil fertilizing technique. I planted a lot of seeds and then grew microgreens in the greenhouse. One of the things I was thinking a lot about was bacteroids is responsible for the digestion of protein, but the microbiome that immigrants of color that they were losing, Previtola, it's responsible for the breakdown of fibers and vegetables. So inside, I was in the space for about 6 weeks, and this is the culminating kind of how it looked like at the end. And anyone who came into the public coming into the installation, I would offer them makgeolli, which is fermented rice drink. And throughout, I had multiple programming, organizing them with different chefs and different organizers. The first opening activity, it was with Springersong Institute, and we had a performance dinner. And I also invited Lauren Fournier, who organized the workshop called Fermentation as Harm Reduction and Migrating with Microbes. And here we were playing a lot with SCOBY and thinking about what it means to have a mutually beneficial symbiosis. And at the end, I had a culminating dinner activity with Spiral Theory Test Kitchen. They're an experimental chef collective based in New York at the moment. And I invited around 20 guests, and it was an 8-course dinner, I believe, with custom hand-blown glass vessels, and eating the greens that I was cultivating, foraging them together with the folks, and drinking fermented drinks. This is one of the examples of the hand-blown glass vessels. The next project I wanted to share with you, it's called Inframembrane, and that was installed September of 2020 on Wave Hill. It's a public botanical garden based in Bronx, New York. And here I was responding very specifically to the material and the institutional history of Wave Hill. Wave Hill is situated right in front of the Palisades Cliff. The view of the Palisades, which is the border between New York and New Jersey, it's a very iconic cliff where it was a source of inspiration for a lot of American painters, where naturalism, the kind of movement, was founded. And this is the Palisades Cliff, an archival photo where there was an active kind of history of expropriation and extraction of the Palisades diabase rock, because that rock was used to construct the foundations of New York City. And I was really interested in this kind of history of extractive capitalism in direct contrast to how we understand the landscape. Like here, the kind of like the beautiful iconic Palisades Cliff. It was also a lot of, it was an important site for the New York City bourgeoisie, for their yacht club. So thinking really critically about which bodies and landscapes become extracted or exhausted of this kind of expropriation, I wanted to reject this language of object-oriented mastery or permanence, to think really critically about what would ephemerality and working hands-on with the landscape look like as an artist. So I went to the gardens in the back, the gardens of New York, of Wave Hill, where it's rarely celebrated. It's not the gardens where it's taxonized. There are no garden plaques there, but there's a really rich host of trees and mycelium fungal networks. So I gathered a handful of indigenous mold, which means leaf piles that have been undisturbed, and the microbial symbionts leaking to their nearby ecological partners. So grabbing a little handful of that and fermenting the soil and feeding the soil a rich diet of rice and sugar. So this is an image of the active fermentation process with the soil. The brown sugar is kind of an energy source, and the soil is eating almost kind of like how you would imagine a petri dish, but it's grabbing the substrates onto the rice. It's using the rice as a substrate. And again, this was inspired by Chadam farming. They talk a lot about how to make indigenous microorganisms from native soil. They encourage to use very cheap and accessible substrates like rice and potatoes. And in doing so, you're also kind of cultivating the full microbiodiversity of the soil, rather than kind of the petri dish where you have E. coli bacteria suppressing some bacteria and cultivating another. And Yang Sang Cho, the founder of Chadam, talks a lot about how the kind of division of good versus bad bacteria is inherently undergirded by technologies like agricultural industrialization or pesticides or herbicides, and that also lead to lead farmers in debt. So I was really interested, again, working with the full kind of microdiversity of the soil. This is an image of the soil eating rice, and that's the mold in the middle with in that vitrine. And over time, the exhibition that was installed for 6 weeks, the mold would obviously change shape. It would sometimes get discolored. And I was really interested also in that experience of the audience or the public witnessing the installation differently each time, and not privileging kind of static viewing, again, that's centered on the human experience, but thinking about the experience of the soil or the bacteria in the soil. I had 4 prints in that installation, and they were an homage to the 4 pre-estate or pre-colonial trees, the only remaining pre-colonial trees on Wave Hill Estate. These 2 over here, one's sugar maple tree and one is a red oak tree. And thinking about, and these were titled portraits of the trees. So thinking about what would the trees, how would they have witnessed that history of expropriation or displacement in that kind of vastly time scale. Also had a single channel video that was told from the perspective of the soil bacteria. Again, I was thinking a lot about the anthropologist Trintimina, the framework of speaking nearby, but not for the other. In the video, I would show snippets of the process of fertilizing the soil using potatoes and rice. And this is an image that shows all those kind of bubbling action. Those are the kind of microbes that are being harvested and repopulating. Another incubator. This is an image of a process of the soil microbes using the rice as substrate. And you can see there are various colors like red, there's a little bit of green and gray, and it's really showing the kind of full microdiversity of the soil. And at the end of the exhibition, I returned all that I've harvested or extracted from the land back to where its source of origin, in the back gardens of Wave Hill. And around I had these garden plaques. Usually you would have more of the traditional like Latin names for these plants, but instead I wanted to destabilize that kind of like Eurocentric Enlightenment language. And this is just some process shots of me returning all of the fertilizer. I really wanted to think about ephemerality and like giving away, it's working against the kind of the gesture of accumulation or material accumulation that I used to work with as an artist. I can't see my slide, but this is the last slide for me. I had a closing essay about this project. That is written here. Oh, there it is. Okay, I can read it now. 400-year-old trees in the Palisades are cut down into plantation houses in the south. Diabase rock of the cliff is blasted into building foundations of New York City. The Hudson River becomes a dumping ground for petrochemicals, and black and brown bodies move the earth. Catherine Yusof in A Billion Black Anthroposes or None describes Blackness as, quote, deformation of subjectivity that presses an inhuman categorization and the earth into intimacy, end quote. In the making of an empire called man, and by extension, the gardens at Wave Hill and its conquest, earth and the other become materials for properties and personhood. Matter is formed into non-being. Porosity is named as expansion. Malleability is thought of awaiting extraction. the commons enclosed for privatization. To remain porous, we have to allow for self-corrosion, the decreation of our objective bodies.
Thank you so much, TJ. I just want to confirm, great, I think that was the end of the presentation. Thanks so much, TJ. I love the plaques so much, and they were really beautiful. And I also wanted to point out something you said, this idea of speaking nearby but not for the others has, interestingly enough, been something that has come up in multiple talks in this symposium, especially the one by Tyrone Bastian and Yas Morgan, and the recordings of, I believe all of our talks and panels are posted on C Magazine's YouTube page, and if they're not posted yet, they will be. We're posting them as the talks go. So if that's of interest to someone, please check out the recording of that talk. So yeah, thanks so much. The next speaker is Miriam Jordan-Haladyn, and she's a First Nations writer, artist, and scholar. She's the author of Groundwork for Haudenosaunee Philosophy and Dialogic Materialism, Batkin, Embodiment, and Moving Image Art, as well as numerous writings on contemporary art and Indigenous cultural history. With Julian Halidon, she curated Ways of Being, Yoni Scarce and Michael Belmore, and the films and videos of Jamali Hassan. So I'll move things over to you. Thanks so much, Miriam.
Thank you, Maya. May I do this? Okay. So my cat very much wants to be part of this presentation. This is Lars Van Troublemaker, so we're going to let him be here. So what I'm talking about today is Haudenosaunee medicine and land and my artwork. What my practice consists of is basically drawing the plants that are used by the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois or Six Nations, as medicine. So I'm Oneida Nation, and one of the elements that's also coming out in my practice is the use of Indigenous languages. Specifically, I started exploring Iroquoian languages, of which there are 6. I'm currently studying Oneida right now, and I've previously studied Mohawk. So the language is part of the process as well. So my practice is the last few years, I set out in the spring, and I just walk around my yard and my neighborhood, and I find plants, I take pictures of them, and then I eventually end up drawing them. And usually the plants actually call out to me. So many of the plants that I'm going to show you today are considered weeds to be eradicated by Western convention. And I've moved away from petrochemicals like herbicides, fungicides, and pesticides. I don't use these anymore on my yard. And these are pushed by petrochemical corporations because we need to move away from this because they are literally destroying our worlds. As I've moved away from this chemical, more and more plants I've been finding in my yard every year. And many of these plants are actually traditional medicines or foods that were used by my ancestors. The Haudenosaunee consider plants and animals sentient beings that are our relatives. In my own writing, I call them other than human beings. And other than human being is simply another being, obviously not human, that has a different form and way of living in the world. So other than human beings, as I discuss, they can be plants, they can be animals, fish, fungi, even rocks. So these are all things that are alive and have power by our traditions. So when we gather plants for medicine, we talk to them and we'll tell them what we're harvesting them for. We'll offer them tobacco, which is Nicotiana rustica, or as we say in Oneida, Oyung Gwa Unwe. And that means Indian tobacco or sacred tobacco. It literally translates from Oneida as real tobacco. And so when we harvest plants, we will offer them real tobacco, and we will tell plants what we need medicine for, what we want to use them for. It's interesting that in Oneida, the language itself, the name of the plant tells us how the plant itself is conceived as another than human being. So we're looking at pictures of native tobacco. It's Oyungwa Unwe, which is how you say it in Oneida. It sometimes can be found as a weed, but it's largely been wiped out in the northeastern part of North America because of broadleaf herbicide use. So the plant itself, all parts of it contain nicotine, which is a narcotic, and it was an old-fashioned herbicide, insecticide used by the Haudenosaunee, and my ancestors taught colonists how to use it. This specific breed of tobacco, it is sometimes called Indian tobacco or sacred tobacco. I've heard it from time to time called ceremonial tobacco. And the smoke of this tobacco is said to act as a bridge between us and the spirit world or other beings. So typically what you do is you either burn a small amount of tobacco in a fire, such as a ceremonial fire, or you offer it to a plant in a small amount, or you'll offer it in a small bundle wrapped in cotton with cotton or twine. And most of the times, people don't smoke it. We usually only smoke this kind of tobacco when we're having gatherings of outsiders, such as the way we did with our colonists. But when we do use it, we usually don't smoke it. We'll burn it in a small amount or give it dried. And when we use tobacco, we're usually using it as a medicine. And so what we will do is we will ask the plant, offer tobacco, and then tell the plant what we're requesting of it. Hunters will sometimes use tobacco when they've successfully captured an animal. They'll thank the animal, give it some tobacco, and thank it for its meat and for its skin. And so you offer tobacco when you're asking for something important, like a song, a smudge, or guidance from an elder or grandmother, or if you're asking for healing medicine. The language itself tells us how we conceive animals and plants. They actually, in Iroquois language, get their own phenomena. It's in Oneida, we have I, you, he, she, and it, which animals and plants are classified under. So yo is the pronominal prefix that goes in front of our construction of the word real tobacco, and yo itself is the pronominal prefix that represent other than human beings. They will either be classified as her, she, or it. And it's never used to reference a human. You would never use this pronominal to reference a human. It simply doesn't happen. This shows how in the Iroquois languages itself, we have a space in our language for animals, things that Western culture doesn't really consider sentient, such as rock and soil. We consider these animate objects, and this is the phenomena that we will use to reference it. I'm going to skip over this. I know maybe I shouldn't. The 7 cardinal points are important because it helps us think of ourselves in relation to other beings. And most of you are familiar with 4 cardinal points, and that is north, south, east, and west. Well, there are additional layers to this. And actually, these layers are mirrored in our languages as well. It's all relational. So you have also the above, which is can be considered the spirit world. We also have the below, or Mother Earth. And the 7th point is where you are. And nobody can be where you are but you. And where you are will always be in relation to other living beings, whether they are humans or whether they are other than human beings, such as plants, such as animals or fungi or rock. So these are all alive, and we have a relationship with them that is fundamental to our very being. So looking at my own artwork, these are Iroquois medicine drawings, an installation view. I started doing these drawings from medicine that was actually out in the public sphere, because we have ceremonies that are meant to be just for us and not outsiders. The reason for this is because we've had anthropologists come into our communities and reveal private ceremonies in a public way, which we don't want. So I specifically chose medicine that were already out in the public realm. They were made public in 1977 by the anthropologist James Herrick, when he published his book, Iroquois Medical Botany. And this was his dissertation, and he later published it as a book. But what I was interested when I got a copy of his book is that there were no Iroquois languages on it. So I tracked down his dissertation, and the languages were there. And so for me, it really became about connecting the Iroquois languages and the plants and bringing all of these elements together. Things that I didn't know. So Herrick's Iroquois Medical Botany doesn't really have any illustrations in it. Many of the plants I actually didn't know. So I set out to go out on walks, teach myself the plants, and draw them, not just for myself, but for other people within my community who've lost contact with these teachings. So I have some botany training from my grandfather, who was a plant scientist, and he actually taught me as a child how to draw plants, and he actually would set me to this project. So part of my practice is walking around and finding the plants that are around me. And a lot of my drawings, many of these plants I found are in my yard. So during my walks, I would find that specific plant called my attention. I'd take pictures of them, I'd go home and I'd identify them. And then I'd draw them, and I would draw in the Iroquois languages for each specific plant, and also how to use the medicine. And amazingly, almost all the plants I found on my walks, they are almost all medicines. So the plant that we're looking at is Dialogically, and that's Seneca, and that is Ribes americanum, or the wild black currant. So this plant grows wild along fields and in woods. It can grow into large woody shrubs. In fact, some of my neighbors use them as shrubs. But this is bad for me because I have a white pine tree in my yard, which is a sacred tree to the Iroquois. And ribes is a reservoir for fungal pathogen, which can kill my eastern pine tree. So I periodically have these turn up in my yard, and I have to kill them because I don't want them to kill my pine tree. This, along with this plant, Duhicta, which means berries or common gooseberries. This too often grows in shrubs. along the edges of woods and fields. It produces an edible berry called the gooseberry. It's also a reservoir for white pine blister rust, which would kill my eastern pine tree. So these two plants are actually part of a medicine. You use this two plants together to have a medicine rain. So together, you will use these plants either to tell fortunes, or they're used when you don't know a medicine for a particular illness. So dreaming is a large part of Haudenosaunee culture. We actually have games for guessing games. And talking about dreams and how to make real our dreams or interpreting our dreams is actually the forebear to psychoanalysis. The Haudenosaunee are actually said to have inspired Freud on his conceptions of the unconscious. So we use this medicine to have a dream so that we can dream up the medicine. And usually it can be used by an accomplished medicine person, or it can be used by a beginner who is under the guidance of an elder. So what you do is you scrape equal parts of the bark off of this plant, both plants, and you add the bark to water and you boil it down to 1 quart of water. You also add a silver quarter to this. And I think it needs to be silver because it causes a chemical reaction. So once this is done, remember before you make it, you have to offer tobacco as you gather the plant. And then after you've ingested this tea, then you go to bed and you will dream of the correct medicine. And then you'll talk about it with the patient and interpret it. So this next plant is called Anuga, and it's known as the Trembling Aspen. I've provided a video so you can recognize it in the wild. It's sometimes called the shaking aspen, and you can recognize it by the leaves shaking. So the bark of this tree contains salicylates from which aspirin is derived. And one usage of this is for pleurisy. So what we'll do is we'll scrape the bark and we'll wet it with hot water and we'll apply it to the chest as a poultice. In this case, the plant acts as an anti-inflammatory, which is what it is used for today in contemporary Western medicine as well. The second use by my ancestors was for treating worms in horses and humans, also cats and dogs. So you take 2 handfuls of water, 2 handfuls of bark, and you put it into about 6 quarts of water, boil it down to 1 quart, and then you drink it as a tea for humans, or you mix it in feed for animals. It's actually also contemporary used to treat worms as well. And then this next plant is a really cool plant. It's Oedad Jiwaga, or also known as yellowwood sorrel. I cultivate this in my yard actually because my budgies like to eat it. The Seneca elder Henry Madai said that this was one of 10 ingredients of an anti-witch medicine. But the Seneca also used this for a summer illness characterized by nausea, cramps, and fever. And what you would do is you would take 4 plants, crush it, put it into a teacup of lukewarm water and drink it. And you would repeat this until your symptoms are relieved. Another usage, and I think this is actually great, sometimes I do this, the leaves of this plant taste lemony. So we use this to freshen our breath. So we would chew on it or soak it in a bottle of water and use the water to freshen our breath in the morning. And this next plant, I actually found it up at my cottage that I've gone to since I was a child. and it's gua e gon e o da gua, or whippoorwill moccasin. That's in Seneca, and the next word is Guayan o Dagua, which is Mohawk for rabbit slipper. But so you can see that there's a common theme, not only in the Iroquois languages, but also in English, to call this some type of slipper or moccasin. But anyway, I found this plant up at the cottage where I spend my summer. I went up in June this year. I'm not normally up there, and I'd never seen this plant before. So this was outside my cabin, and a stream that runs into the lake, and the stream only runs during the spring. So this plant is a part of, it's used to treat lassitude and nervousness and also lack of energy. So basically what you do is in the spring, you offer the plant tobacco, tell the plant that you are gathering its root for medicine. And then you can either use it fresh or let it dry. And then you would typically steep the root to make a tea for yourself. This next plant is called Dig Dagwa Do Gag, and it's called cricket root or anemone in English. So there are two uses for this plant as a medicine. So it grows in wooded areas in May and June that are damp and by water. And we use this to do worm keeper. So you take the root and you boil it in 1 quart of water, and then the patient drinks the resulting tea. The second usage, I'm not going to talk about the second usage. This next plant is an interesting plant. The June legs guan yan, or cultivating, and that's Onondaga there. We use it as a cough medicine or for those who have TB. It can still be used as a cough medicine. So what you do is you take the root and you let it sit in liquor for several days, liquor of your choice, preferably something you like. And this is my drawing of it. And contemporary science shows that cultivating has anti-inflammatory activities, it's neuroprotective, as well as anti-diabetic, and it has lots of antioxidant activity in it. It shouldn't be taken for long periods of time. It's not considered toxic, but there are some buts, like don't gather this plant in areas known or suspected to be contaminated by pollutants, as the plant will absorb it and it will pollute you. It will poison you. What's interesting is I found the most recent text that I found on this was actually a Chinese study of this plant as in an ethnobotany journal. It's quite fascinating that actually a lot of people are now looking to our medicine to find medicines that are actually useful. So the next plant is, I'm talking about the drawing here on the left. I don't really have a good image of it. The two drawings show plants that were used for contraception. And these plants are typically found in the woods in springtime. So these are, this is one of the plants which you can see here. It's called Ghana Wenda. Ghana Wenda, sorry, or trout lily. And that's Kuyuga, for it means broken neck or bent neck. So all of the Iroquois languages for this plant reference the way the flowers seem to nod its head or its neck is bent. So the roots of this plant are eaten with the next plant, DJ, or Eastern spring lily. They're eaten together and conception is prevented. So young girls can eat the plants themselves, but not the roots. So if you eat both of the roots, you'll never have children. So it's well known how the Haudenosaunee women were at the time of colonization notably able to control conception well before the Europeans. And it was actually something, especially the Jesuits tried to stamp out for their own purposes. So this is looking at some of the languages for Claytonia virginica, which we see on the right. So the Mohawk call it bear's paw, and the Oneida also call it bear's foot. So we have a tendency to name things after what it looks like in reality, similar to it. Okay, so this next plant is Ganadan guishagus, which means smells like a horse or black cohosh. And it's used for 2 or 3 different medicines. This is my drawing of it. The title, as it tells us, it can be used to promote milk production. And I actually tested this on my husband's other sister. When she had her babies, she couldn't produce enough milk. So I suggested, can you make a tea of this and try it and see if it works? And it actually did. She noticed an increase in her milk production, and she'd be mortified to know I was talking about it now. You can also use that as an anti-inflammatory tea as well. So you just heat it up and make a tea out of it. This plant is Yago de Sugs, which makes you dream. The plant is also called bad straw, and it has kumar in it, which is used in modern perfume. It has a very sweet vanilla scent. And we also used it to make buds out of it. It grows in long bunches, and it can quickly overtake an area. But we use it for dreams. And what you do is you simply take a little bit of the hair of it after you've offered tobacco and you've told the plant what you want from it. You chew on the hair of the plant, and then you go to bed, and supposedly it will make you dream. This next plant, you can see a detail of it from my drawing. It's called Ananda Egoa, or burdock. And you've definitely seen this around for certain. Again, it's usually considered a weed. The photo showed what it looked like around midsummer, but by the end of the summer, it's got really huge leaves, and these are sort of purpley thistle-like flowers. So you can use this as a medicine for a lot of different things. You can use it for bee stings and stuff like that. But you can also use it as part of a medicine for conception. So this is a drawing of all the plants that were used to prepare a woman to conceive a baby. And one plant will provide abundant iron. I think it's this plant right here, and yellow dock or teta. And other plants are antibiotics, anti-inflammatories. Some of them are rich in iron. And I actually did this drawing from my sister-in-law because she was having trouble conceiving. I'm running out of time, so move on. And she actually did get pregnant after she got this drawing as a gift from me. This next drawing is a ghost medicine. It's a Nufa, or these are some of the names for it. And it's Sego and Oneida for snake root. This is, I love Yadagunk. It's Seneca for body in the water, because usually when you see this plant, it creates a large body in the water. There are frogs on it, fish living underneath. So it has a lot of wildlife around it. So we use this plant basically when somebody has died, and you take the root, you soak it in water, and you sprinkle it around the places where they like to spend time. It's both for the dead and for the grieving, and it helps in the mourning process. This next one is called Takes the Chill Out of Blood. And these two plants are used as tidacida for someone who's suffering from a feverish cold. And it's made from two plants. I think I have, these are the names, Seneca and basically what the medicine are used for is you can use it to deworm babies, and you can use it basically to treat a feverish cold. And this plant, this medicines, I won't show the details. All of these plants together are used to induce a miscarriage. And this drawing is really about women's sovereignty over our bodies. Not only did the Haudenosaunee women have medicine to help conceive, but when necessary, we had medicines to terminate a pregnancy. This was not something we often wanted, but we recognized that we needed to do it. And it seemed timely that I'm talking about this now. So these medicines were used to protect the health of the mother, and they were also used in times of war and famine. So it was up to the women to decide if these medicines were necessary. And they were also used if something was determined to be wrong with the fetus. So these medicines specifically were controlled by women, not by men. And there was no societal shame in using these medicines in pre-contact time, as pregnancy wasn't the political football that it is today in parts of North America. So traditionally, Haudenosaunee women had full control of their fertility, as this drawing shows in the medicine. This is also another contraceptive. This is called prevent conception. And this plant called wahiagas, which means strong smelling berries in Onondaga. You can use this plant mainly the bark of the shrub. It's basically a shrub to prevent conception. And actually our creation day talk about this in the conception of sapling and flint by Lynx, who is Sky Woman's daughter. We use this plant to make arrows out of, and that's mentioned in the creation day when Lynx gets pregnant. Her lover places 2 arrows on her stomach and she becomes pregnant. And that's a reference to how this specific plant can be used to prevent pregnancy. And an interesting thing about this plant, every woman in my family has this plant growing outside her house. We've been planting it, and my mom didn't know why she was planting it, and neither did my grandmother, but we were all planting it. And so that's really fascinating that we were doing that, even if we didn't know why, okay? So that's my last slide, and I'm going to give this back. No, I don't want to do the share.
That's great. Thank you so much, Miriam, for that presentation. I learned so much, and I've always been so interested ever since I heard about your research around plant medicines and contraception and for contraception and conception. It's so interesting. So thanks again. Thanks so much for your generosity and in sharing with us all of that. And before I introduce our last speaker, I want to remind everyone to please feel free to start writing in questions in the Q&A. You can do that at any time. So yeah, the next speaker is Zoe Todd, and Zoe is an expert in Indigenous perspectives on freshwater fish conservation in Western Canada, and more specifically Alberta. And their fish philosophy work brings together Indigenous science, art, social studies, stories, and legal thinking about fish as more than human kin. Their current projects examine how Indigenous governance shapes and refracts Western fish conservation paradigms. They are the co-founder of the Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures, which is an international collective of scientists, artists, writers, landscape architects, environmentalists, journalists, and community leaders dedicated to honoring reciprocal responsibilities to freshwater fish in watersheds locally and globally. So thank you so much, Zoe.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to share my slides. No. Can everyone hear me? I just want to make sure it's all working. Tansei, Zoe Nitsigasun.
Zoe, sorry to interrupt you. I can hear you all right, but the screen that you are sharing is the Sea Magazine website.
Oh, you can't see my slides. Okay. Today's one of those days where things aren't always working. So is that there we go. Okay, perfect. So I'll start again. Tansei Zoe Nitsigason, Neo Odapemsu Esqueo, Ego Maga, Snanaas Qualicum, New again, Gananaskomi Noel, Marcy Kakao, Niwako Makinak. So thank you to everyone for attending today. And it's also such an honor to get to present alongside TJ and Miriam, and I just learned so much from both of your talks. And thank you to Maya for inviting us and to Alex for the tech work. And so I'm just going to talk about fish and some of the work that my incredible colleagues and I are doing on fish in Alberta and other watersheds that we're accountable to. So this talk explores a facet of the emerging field of critical Indigenous fish philosophy that I and my colleagues in the Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures are engaging in our shared and divergent projects and commitments across numerous homelands and watersheds around the planet. In this talk, I explore how listening to fish can be a crucial mode through which to help disrupt white possessive colonial claims after the work of Eileen Morton Robinson on the concept of the white possessive, to control knowledge, power, lands, waters, and narratives here in so-called Canada. Fish, who've been around on this planet for 510 million odd years, have so much to teach us about how to survive and thrive on a planet in constant flux. And much of my work is deeply influenced by Indigenous legal scholars and scientists who built space for my generation to join the academy. And so today we will open the talk with a quote from one such trailblazer, who is Kainai scholar, leader, and philosopher, Dr. Leroy Littlebear. I'm just going to skip ahead. So this work is rooted in my relationships to my family. This is a picture of my dad, Gary Todd, who's a Métis artist. And this is a picture of us when I was little along the North Saskatchewan in the Eastern Slopes, which is where one of my major projects that I am part of is taking place, where we're working with Stoney Nakoda Nations knowledge keepers and scientists to understand how to better protect bull trout. The work is also deeply influenced by my late stepfather, Wayne Roberts, who was also a biologist. So Miriam, we have kind of a similar theme with family members who were scientists who helped us come into these relationships. Work is also deeply influenced by my dear friend and collaborator, Amar Khan-Gieser, who I'll talk about it a little bit. So Leroy Littlebear, at a talk that he gave in Calgary in 2016, said, quote, "Western science is largely aimed at exploration. Native science is aimed at sustainability. We exist in a very narrow gap, as we've mentioned. And the fish, for instance, nobody's talked about the fish in this Congress, not that I know of. But the fish has been around, think about it, way before the dinosaurs, way before the Neanderthals, way before our time. The fish is still around. I wonder what scientific formula the fish has discovered. We should ask the fish. They've survived," end quote. And I use this quote to open almost every talk that I give because it really is one of the foundational parts of this critical Indigenous fish philosophy that my team and I are doing. And the first thing that arises when I share this quote with other parties is that I'm often asked, so how do we ask the fish what they have discovered? And for a very long time, I stumbled in how to answer this question and how to come up with answers for non-Indigenous audiences, especially, who may not be attuned to the work of listening beyond the two-dimensional, planar, one-note metrics of empirical data, human dominion over the environment, and the Cartesian ideas of objective human observation of a static natural world that humans exist outside of. But in working with my dear friend and collaborator, Dr. Amar Khan-Gieser, who is a geographer and sound artist who works in the Pacific, I realized that those well-meaning audience members have been asking maybe the wrong question. Asking the fish what they have discovered, as Dr. Leroy Littlebear urges us to do, is not necessarily about talking. In fact, I now realize in many ways it's about learning how to listen to them. And it is in listening to fish and the ways that they communicate to us, including through their withdrawal from unsuitable or damaged habitats over the course of the last several hundred years of colonial violence across vast Indigenous homelands, or even in their fishy return when habitats are restored and repaired. It is through this kind of embodied listening to fish that we learn how to mobilize the appropriate environmental governance ethics and laws required to honor the fish as scientists in their own right. So just as Dr. Leroy Littlebear urges us to ask the fish what scientific formula they have discovered over their 500 million years on the planet, which I contend is possible by learning to listen to the fish in embodied ways, as Amar encourages us to do in their work, we also need settlers here in so-called Canada to learn to listen and feel what Indigenous sovereignty is in all of its refractions, not just the anthropological capture of an imagined form of pan-Indigenous tradition that conveniently upholds the white possessive, as Eileen Morton Robinson, Audra Simpson, and others demonstrate, but to truly confront what plural Indigenous sovereignties feel like in our bodies within the dynamic context of Indigenous life across myriad homelands. And I've been thinking a lot lately with Teresa McCarthy's fantastic work on regressive authenticity in settler understandings of Haudenosaunee governance, and Audra Simpson's critiques of anthropological erasure of Native sovereignty here in Canada and the USA. And though I'm Métis, these two Haudenosaunee anthropologists have been really instructive for me as a recovering anthropologist who's trying to work beyond the systems that I was trained in within that discipline. So when local Indigenous governance systems are centered in freshwater fish conservation, and local peoples have greater control over resource and conservation activities in our respective homelands, both humans and fish benefit. And we keep seeing this again and again in the work that our team is doing and in other scientific studies going on. So we work within largely the Lake Winnipeg watershed, which stretches from the Rocky Mountains to Lake Winnipeg, but it also includes waters in Northwestern Ontario, Northern Manitoba, Minnesota, and the tiniest little bit of Montana. With all of this in mind, these concepts of listening, of sovereignty, of autonomy, it's clear that we need an explicitly critical decolonizing approach to studying Indigenous governance and freshwater fish conservation, an approach that is rooted in material, concrete changes to the structures through which Indigenous lands were taken by colonial governments and resource extractive industries. So in our work within the Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures, our team reminds regulators and policymakers and other scholars that there is no one-size-fits-all Indigenous science, art, or law. In fact, as the late Peruvian social scientist Anibal Quijano reminded us 20 years ago, the erasure of distinct Indigenous societies and nations in Africa and in the Americas, and the folding of distinct societies into racial categories was a key mode through which colonial power was extended over sovereign autonomous peoples. The erasure of distinct Indigenous nations and societies into a racial category of Indigenous subsumes distinct Indigenous cosmologies, and attempts to fold us back into that planar or binomial or flat land of the Western colonial white supremacist universal. So in our work, we remind settler interlocutors that there are multiple Indigenous sciences, multiple Indigenous arts, and legal orders informed by each nation's specific relations, stories, and histories with and in place across many continents. And for us, we think about the fish and the water, but there's so many other brilliant people across so many homelands working with other more than human or other than human relations, as you just got to see earlier in both TJ and Miriam's brilliant talks. So this is all to say that we call upon our Western peers to make sure that they are not erasing local stories, knowledge, and laws with popular pan-Indigenous concepts that are applied from elsewhere without first listening very closely to local stories and local needs. And I think both TJ and Miriam showed how important that close listening is and how powerful it is in the art that is produced from that careful listening. So, so this is just the bull trout. This is who we work with, Salvelinus confluentis. This is just some art that I've been doing to kind of think through some of the issues we're working on. But what does it look like to listen to fish across plural ontologies, cosmologies, and worlds without folding that experience into the possessive and eliminatory logics of Western law, art, and science? Listening in ways that help settlers involved in fights to protect various watersheds and homelands to understand their obligations to sovereign Indigenous peoples and to sovereign fish. What does a quantum pluriversal form of listening look like in this context? So in our work, we contend that listening to fish is an embodied affair. Western science believes that fish were the first vertebrates who learned how to listen or hear. And critically, hearing in fish is both an auditory process involving their ears and otoliths, which are ear bones, which is not so entirely different from us as human mammals. But one very cool thing about fish is that they also listen through their bodies, through the lateral line. And I chose this picture of a beautiful bull trout, and its lateral line is just so pronounced in the photo. And so that's what we're going to think with for a little bit here. So the lateral line essentially extends the sensory organs through the body so that the fish can sense changes in pressure in the water around them, meaning that they are gathering and interpreting data from their immersive 3D environment at all times. And this is exactly what allows schools of fish to coordinate their behavior so effectively, moving almost as one when needed. And so I just think this is such a brilliant thing. And this is one of the scientific formula that the fish have discovered, and our team talks about many others. So from their work on listening and attunement and climates of listening, Amar Kangieser teaches us that listening requires discernment and involves the entire body. It is about learning what consent to be in an environment feels like, what no feels like within an environment or watershed, and what boundaries feel like in our environment. And for settlers like Amar, it is about respecting what is not for outsiders to know or possess within Indigenous homelands. It is this fishy kind of listening with the body, the use of the lateral line, that is perhaps the most instructive lesson from the fish for those of us trying to discern which settler spaces are truly safe to build partnerships and collaborations within on the one hand, and those which are merely keeping up appearances to maintain control of lands, resources, power, and capital on the other hand. And so we think extensively about learning to discern between whether a space is actually committed to doing work that is ethical, accountable, and with integrity, or those settler spaces that are sort of just saying the right words and like weaponizing concepts like decolonization, but not living those in those sort of material everyday relations in a way that actually is going to help us change the systems that are doing harm to fish, waters, lands, and other more than human beings. So this listening and attunement, learning to trust the information our bodies are communicating to us from our environment, information that goes very far beyond the visual flourishes of colonial spaces. This kind of listening is so crucial in enabling us to navigate between the flatness of Western universalism and the quantum dynamism of our plural Indigenous knowledge systems across many, many homelands. In his 1966 essay, A Report from Occupied Territory, James Baldwin details ongoing anti-Black violence enacted by the police against community members in Harlem in the 1960s, violence that extends back to the very formation of the settler colonizer United States of America, the nation state of Canada, and also the formation of an entire planetary order altered by the invocation of white supremacist, colonial capitalist, Christian imperialist man and science, as Sylvia Wynter teaches us. In this essay, Baldwin writes in the concluding paragraph that, quote, "One is in the impossible position of being unable to believe a word one's countrymen say. I can't believe what you say," the song goes, "because I see what you do," end quote. I want to be explicit that the context I write in as a Métis person from the prairies is very different from what Baldwin is describing in Harlem in the 1960s. I do not want to misappropriate the visceral state terrorism that Baldwin describes, which is employed by the white colonial imperialist police to incarcerate, possess, violate, and control Black communities in New York City and cities across the continent then and now. However, the invocation of belief, of listening, of looking past the words employed by white supremacist institutions and actors is palpable and instructive for analyzing the frameworks being asserted by colonial actors in Canada today towards Black and Indigenous communities and other communities united across geographies of white supremacist dispossession and displacement. When one listens in closely and feels into the underlying logics of these liberal frameworks, espousing a desire to reconcile Indigenous peoples, to integrate knowledges, to co-create art, lofty promises couched in new language while occupying the same stolen lands and controlling the same treasuries, it is not hard to discern whether they are still built on the same possessive, eliminatory logics that dispossess, displace, and marginalize Black and Indigenous peoples and communities across myriad watersheds, lands, and communities. If there's one lesson that I hope you can take from this short talk, it is the need to cut through the outer layers, the appearances of colonial claims, colonial articles, conferences, workshops, and policy briefs, and to use all of our senses, our embodied ways of knowing, to relearn how to trust our gut, our ears, the receptors in our skin, the chemical receptors throughout our bodies, and as Leroy Littlebear might also argue, spirit, to discern whether what is being said to us by colonial parties in fact lines up with the political and social commitments of Indigenous nations and communities. So in the settler colonial nation state, you have to learn quickly, as Baldwin details, to discern between what is said and what is meant by colonial actors. Your survival depends on it. And I gently contend that in the context of Indigenous sovereignty, it is important to hold settler institutions to account for their propensity to modulate their viral or cancerous intentions and new protein coats or new language to try to evade detection by the immune systems of our communities, the ways that we know how to listen in other registers. So in so doing, in learning both how to listen to the fish, but also learning how to listen like the fish, we have the potential to reorient our partnerships, collaborations, commitments towards those that truly honor our reciprocal obligations to fish communities and to plural human communities displaced and dispossessed by colonial imperial logics of elimination and possession. So here in Canada, that work starts from the basis of acknowledging Indigenous sovereignty, full stop, and invites colonial parties to work in an honorable way that addresses the complex and plural histories of colonial domination, genocide, and oppression that have impacted Indigenous peoples' relationships to fish and water across many continents, and invite settler colonizers to step into relationships with Indigenous peoples that acknowledge Indigenous societies are autonomous, storied, and are carriers of millennia of knowledge about protecting watersheds, fish, the environment, and community well-being. One of the best places to start this work is for colonial parties to listen, really truly listen in a thoughtful, careful, and immersive way to what Indigenous peoples have to say about how to reimagine the very basis upon which Canada relates to the lands, waters, atmospheres, and other more than human beings that it claims. So we contend humbly that this is how we start the work of building collective futures for and with fish, waters, forests, lands, and with one another. So Ginanas Komitin, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for such a thoughtful presentation. I have so many thoughts running in my head, and I thought I'd start with a question for the three of you as sort of people gather their thoughts and add to the Q&A. One of the most interesting things that I think connects the three of your presentations is really this idea of when to know, when to collaborate and when to reach out to across species, or across boundaries, and when to refuse. And I have a sort of general question for the three of you and a specific question for Miriam. So I'll ask Miriam the specific question, but then we'll go on to Zoe and TJ with the more general questions. But I was thinking about how earlier this week I attended a presentation by a number of Quechua scholars, and they were talking about how there's this term within Ecuador called sumac kaisai that's been sort of taken up by the neoliberal, neocolonial government in Ecuador and translated into the constitution as this good living, but that in reality really translates to this neoliberal extractivist notion. And the discussion was around how this Quechua term has been misrepresented by the government in Ecuador. And one of the audience members asked a Quechua scholar, well, if you were able to translate and explain this term, this philosophy, how would you describe it? And I got a chuckle out of his answer. He said, well, you'd have to learn Quechua to really understand that. And that kind of sassy refusal has stuck with me throughout the week, and I've been thinking about that in all of your presentations. So my specific question for Miriam is, so much of how you explain language and its description of how plants are used and how they have this relationship to humans, it's all tied to language. And you shared with us a lot of your artwork, but you're also a really wonderful artist and an amazing curator. And I'm wondering, when you try to describe these kinds of ideas, these kinds of relationships, or the nature of some of these relationships into your work as a writer, how do you approach a kind of not literal translation between languages, but also a kind of ontological translation that happens there? And then before I let you start, I think, my more general question to the three of you, but specifically to TJ and Zoe, is, how do you understand within your own practices when to reach across a border, when to reach across species, and when to refuse, when to build boundaries? And how has that affected how you work and who you choose to work with? So yeah, that's my question for now. Please go ahead, Miriam.
Okay. One of the things, actually, I'll answer that with a story. One of the plants that I was learning is a plant called dea. And it translates into English as she stands there. And I'm like, what does that mean? What does that even mean? And I was very puzzled by that. And I was looking for this medicine for a long time. And oftentimes I find when you actively go out to gather a medicine, a lot of times the plant doesn't want to be found. Even if you know where the plant grows and you've seen it growing there before, sometimes you can't find it, especially if you go out to look for it. So the plant will reveal itself to you when it wants to. And so I was looking, I'm not kidding, all summer for a plant called Teta. I'm trying to remember the English. It's yellow dark. And then at the end of the summer, last summer, I went out to get my horse in a field in the paddock. And suddenly I saw her. She was literally standing there. She was the only plant that the horses wouldn't eat. And I'm like, my God, that is so brilliant, the language and the way that I found her. And I recognized her simply by the fact that she was the only plant standing in the field. And it was such a beautiful realization of how the language works and also the realities of the plant. So I'm kind of wondering a little bit, but the language is really important because it does tell us something about the plant. And after I found the plant, when I found out later, doing more study, is that horses and cows won't eat this plant. It actually poisons them. And that's part of the reason why the language says what it says. You'll find this plant standing out in field. That's all I was told. And I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't see her anywhere. And then one day I saw her, she was standing there. So there is a close relationship between the medicines themselves, the plants as being, and also understanding their place in the world and our relationship to them. So I'm constantly getting these mini revelations as I study the language more and as I go out and I find more plants. So it's something that's constantly unfolding for me. And for me, it touches on something that Zoe said, not just talking to the world, but listening to the world. You get it, listening to what plants and animals have to say to us. It's just as important. Yeah, that's part of the way I see what I'm doing.
Thank you. Zoe, TJ, do you want to tackle this idea?
Zoe, do you want to go first?
You can go if you want.
Well, when you're talking about refusal, I was thinking about gestures of refusal within my work, and I think they're really subtle. For example, me gravitating towards the site that Wave Hill rarely celebrates, going to the woodland, to the point that, you know, there was a lot of conflict between just choosing that area because of like kind of the institutional like red tapes that you would expect in a public kind of botanical garden, or working with a material that is really ephemeral, porous, that is not static. So when even documenting the work or the public responding to the work, it's changing, and how that really in some ways destabilize what you expect an artwork to do, right? That it is collectible, or that it is static, or that it is archival, based on a very specific kind of market-driven kind of capitalist, again, extractive, or ways of thinking about works. And I think even my installation, microbial speculation of our gut feelings, knowing fully that the risk of nothing growing in that space, and accepting that failure as an outcome, and understanding that's also as equally important. So I think for me, the act of refusal is kind of going against these normative like ideas of like what art making or what art practice or art presentation should look like, and really trying to cultivate the dense relationalities, or the kind of like collaborators that I really want to work with. Sometimes it is collaborating with chefs or anthropologists, or just scholars who really inspired my work, or sometimes just looking and listening, as you mentioned, to the soil and what the soil knows about the place, because they witnessed things that I haven't, and working with them as equal actants. I think that's the kind of risk or acts of refusal I'm thinking about.
I don't have a lot to add. Refusal comes up in our work, and Amr wrote this really beautiful piece at the beginning of January on refusal, and actually going back to like an original meaning of refusal in Latin, which actually means depouring. And I think it's just this like really beautiful meditation. And they were thinking through the idea of like refusing the eco-fascist narratives that like humans are the virus, that kind of emerged around COVID, and like nature is healing and humans are the virus, and those kind of narratives that were circulating. And I'm thinking a lot about that idea of repouring relations, and especially in Alberta, where I'm from, like the ways that the earth is being altered so deeply for resource extractive industries, and trying to find ways to sort of, the fish aren't going to come back to the same landscapes that they knew, but that it's still possible for them to reclaim those landscapes. And thinking about like bull trout were one of the first fish to come back to what is, you know, so-called Alberta today after the last glacial period, about 10,000 to 13,000 years ago. And so they're kind of pros at repouring relations, and that fish have managed to survive all of the last mass extinction events, but they're really not surviving colonial capitalism, white supremacy, and white, you know, sort of imperialism. And so thinking through, like, I guess we're just thinking really deeply about what relationships are necessary to repour those relations. But refusal comes up in its other registers in our work too. Like it becomes really clear where we're not supposed to work. Like you know, grants don't come through, or like if you like pursue a path that's really not supposed to happen, like it's very clear, like it's like, no, you're not supposed to do this project. And we listen, and we're like, okay. And then so like the project that we're doing right now, we'd been trying all these different places to try to do this work, and then I had a dream one night, like at the end of 2018, and I was in an old biology building room at the University of Alberta where my late stepfather worked. And it was about 6 or 7 months after he'd passed away. And I was in a room with 2 colleagues from Carleton, and then someone that Wayne had worked with closely, but I'd never met. And we were all coming to an agreement on something. and I was like, there's like 2 colleagues from my current place of employment that I like do not like my work or treat me well. And so I was very confused about how we were coming to an agreement. And then I woke up in the morning and I called my mom, and I was like, Mom, I had the weirdest dream. And so was there, you know, Wayne's friend, blah, blah, blah. And she was like, Zoe, that's so interesting, because last night I had a dream, and he was there, and he kept repeating to me, I'm not dead yet. I'm not dead yet. And then we had just seen a new grant had been announced, and some of Wayne's old colleagues and friends had actually just written this big letter refusing the government's approach to resource extraction, and a proposed and in support of a proposed management plan in that part of Alberta. And we were like, you know what, we've got to apply to do this work. It's going to be about the bull trout. It's going to be about that land use plan. And we got it, and it was like a 3% acceptance rate. And like we were just blown away. And so I guess I just share that to sort of like we're learning what no feels like when you're not supposed to do something, and we're learning what yes feels like when you need to do something. And that just like embodied feeling of like, we have to apply to this, like not for our ego, not for our CV, but like someone really needs us to do it. So yes, I think it's a really good question.
Thank you, 3, for that. I'm gonna shift over to the Q&A. We have some really great questions from the audience. So the first one is for Miriam, and they're asking, your stories about the herbal medicines are amazing. They remind me of Chinese herbal medicine. Could you say more about the idea of using these herbs for other than human animals as well as humans? I'm interested in the idea of interspecies continuities. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know in fact, I know very little about Chinese herbal medicine. With Haudenosaunee herbal medicine, the whole idea is that the plants are full of life and energy, and they're also beings that are not human, so they have powers that can help us. So part of the medicine process is actually talking to the plant. One of the medicines I showed you was about dreaming the right medicine, and that medicine is done with the patient. Sometimes you'll put an object of the patient under your pillow when you dream. And then after the dream, you'll talk to the patient sometimes the patient will help clarify your dream, and you'll know the medicine to use then. But it's very much a dialogic process, not just between the medicine person and the plant or fungi that might be used, but also between the medicine person and the patient. So there's dialogue going back and forth. Part of what I think makes our medicine practice so beautiful, and I will admit that not all of our medicine works, but many of our medicine do. And I think part of that is what makes them so powerful is the relationships that are formed, the relationship between the patient and the medicine person and the medicine plant. And oftentimes there's a conceptual element of the relationship with the land. We know that as people, we can exist without the land. We can exist with other relations, which are both plants, animals, fish, the water, the grasses, and the land around us. So without these relationships, we don't exist at all. It's really about how these relationships can sustain us. They might seem like they're small things from the Western conception, but they're a very big thing. It's an amazing feeling when you're trying to learn a new medicine and the plant itself reveals it to you, and you've never seen that plant before, and you learn all about it, and then maybe you'll go back to try to find the plant and you can't find it again. I find so many times that it will reveal itself to you when it wants to, when it's necessary. And it's so amazing. I just really can't describe that feeling because in the Western conception, we don't have that. We don't have, I tell some people that I will talk to plants or that I will listen to plants. And sometimes you get a but this is real, and it does give me energy, it does give me health, it does sustain me, and I've seen how it sustains other people. And I think one of the most beautiful elements of our medicine practices are the way in which it can bring people and being together to take care of each other, because that's what the world should be under creation. We should be taking care of ourselves and our relations, which include the landscape. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miriam. The next question is for Zoe. So they're asking, Zoe, can you expand on how the sensory practices of bull trout constitute a scientific formula? Isn't this like pushing a round peg into a square hole and potentially rendering the proposition meaningless? Why limit the fish's apprehension to a constraint of Western rational discourse?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like in the context I'm working in the prairies where my Indigenous ancestors are from, we consider science to be a pretty normal part of our way of relating to the world. Like science, if we take it as sort of the like routine, close observation of phenomena in the world, and then analysis of that phenomena to help you to respond to things in the world, then, you know, yes, we have Métis science, there's Cree science. Dr. Leo Littlebear has spent a whole career talking about Blackfoot science and Blackfoot metaphysics. So I think of it in the sense of universalist Western, you know, post-Enlightenment science claims itself to be the science, but it's actually, it needs to be, you know, provincialized, as Fanon would have said, perhaps, you know, like a new history of man, a new science of man. And so we think of, there's many different bull trout sciences depending on who's having a conversation with them, right? The people that we're working with, the Stoney Nakoda knowledge keepers we're working with, have very specific knowledge based on their relationships to the rivers. My colleague, Janelle Baker, who is descended from both settler and Métis ancestors, her family has very particular knowledge about bull trout from their time in those parts of the province. My late stepdad, Wayne, who was non-Indigenous, he had particular, he was sort of like a renegade naturalist. He dropped out of his PhD. He was a curator at the Museum of Zoology at the University of Alberta, and he did science that like big science, universal science. They didn't really like the work he did, but I saw him practicing a kind of observation and listening to the fish that was really thoughtful. And it's just the saddest thing in the world that he died in 2018, right before we were able to bring him into our projects with Stoney Nakoda elders, because I think he would have learned a lot from how he intuitively kind of moved away from universalist science and did his own kind of careful observation within the Red Deer River watershed throughout his life. So I think I reject the idea of universalist science, even though I have a Bachelor of Science. I think there's many sciences, and that provincializing, sort of Western science is really powerful. And Leroy Littlebear has done so much beautiful work on this. And he sort of talks about, for like, as a Blackfoot or Kainai scholar, he's sort of amused by how Western physicists feel this need to like break everything down further and further and further. And then like now they're, the Higgs boson, and then what else are they going to sort of like need to try and dissect the world down into, when he says like for in his worldview, like it's enough to say that spirit sort of embodies that, that you don't need to break spirit down into these components. And I've always found that a really interesting response. So I don't know if that answers the question, but for us, we're thinking in plural sciences, that there's many different ways to understand the bull trout, and that each Indigenous nation has their own way of understanding them, but also different elements of the environment have their way of understanding bull trout. And like, to some species, bull trout are allies. If you are one of the invertebrates that they eat, they might not be your ally necessarily. So thinking about all those elements, and I just think bull trout are just the niftiest fish too. Like, and so we're just really compelled by them. So that's my answer.
Thanks so much, Zoe. I find this idea of provincializing Western science so interesting. So thank you for that. Our last question for tonight is also for Zoe. So they write, I really appreciate your practice of listening to fish and listening like fish. I'm curious to know what would be a decolonial and ethical way of reckoning with invasive fish species.
Thank you for that question. I think it actually also touches on what TJ and Miriam have spoken about, like making relations, in these kind of altered landscapes that we're engaging with. And so I have there's a colleague named Nick Rio who is Anishinaabe, and he studies invasive species with his community, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Ojibwe on the US side of the border in the Great Lakes. And they've published some really cool stuff on invasive species in their area, like Phragmites, which is a kind of grass, and also invasive forms of cattails, I believe. And what stands out for me in what they've communicated is that community members have said, if those plants are here, then they have something they're trying to tell us. And so we need to figure out what they're telling us so that we can enact good relations with them. And they sort of disrupt this idea of calling something indigenous or invasive if it's a plant. And Miriam, you might have thoughts as a Haudenosaunee scholar on like, because I think each nation will have its own interpretation of that. But I've really taken that kind of message to heart, because in Alberta, we also have like bull trout were considered garbage fish by early conservationists because it bites the fly too early. And so it's not fun for them to fish. And so they called them garbage fish. They tried to remove them, and they brought in brown trout and some other species of sport trout that are not from those waterways. And now bull trout are being outcompeted by them. And that's one of the reasons that they're struggling. So just thinking through, like, how do we enact good relations between species? Like the species, I don't think necessarily chose to be in those positions. And so it's weird how settlers kind of like put those intentions onto plants. It's almost like a way that they like project onto the plants and the animals, and that they can say like, that plant is invasive, it shouldn't be here, we need to root it out. Versus like, or what order of the world allowed it to become in a way that it's not, necessarily enacting good relations. I don't know if I'm saying this in a clear way, but I just got to look at the question again to make sure that I'm answering it properly. But yeah, we're just trying to think about, these other species. We're trying not to put human intentions onto fish. Like, I don't think the brown trout chose to be the fish that outcompeted bull trout, or that was, used after bull trout was called a garbage fish. But we do have to figure out how to foster relations within bull trout's traditional waterways that enable it to flourish. But bull trout's, or brown trout's, not going anywhere, nor are the other introduced species. So we have to figure out how to foster that. And that's one of the questions we're trying to do with critical Indigenous fish philosophy.